That night's events were something I would never anticipate feeling my son rather than my spouse. It was among the most bizarre yet thrilling evenings of my life began as any other peaceful. In the evening, the house carried. After dinner, it's usually quiet. The fading, the whir of the dishwasher in the kitchen, as well as the faint sound of wood. The house went to sleep, and I didn't have any notion that this evening would permanently change how I perceived every aspect of my existence. Myself, my family, and my name is Peter. And I believed I had until lately. I've sorted everything out. I'm 45. Diligent individual who constructed a simple but a contented existence for me, my spouse Emma, and for 16 years I have been married, and despite our marriage's ups and downs, I always thought we were strong. Own two children, including my daughter Clara, who's currently attending college, and my 18-year-old Emma, a son who remains at home. Emma is a community college student who has. Laura and I have always been shy kids. Frequently made jokes about how calm he was to Clara's storm. Due of her location, Emma wanted to stay because of the fire and intensity. In his chamber, either reading or playing with whatever fresh endeavor had caught his attention. Curiosity over the years, I occasionally concerned that he would experience any diminished in comparison to his sister, or perhaps by Laura and I, but each time I inquired, he'd constantly smile and reassure me that he was all right. However, as he grew older, I observed little changes. He appeared more reclusive. When his typically bashful smiles transformed into brief looks, there were times when I would notice him staring at me. I was holding something that I couldn't place. Something is almost searching. I attributed my questioning to being a teenager. Discomfort and never gave it any thought. Believed Laura had spent some time away of town. Days at one of her regular jobs, she was employed at an events firm, and frequently went to conventions and planning meetings. It wasn't something unusual. The norm, and I had been accustomed to defending the fort during her absence. Clara was occupied with her coursework, so Emma and I were the only people in the house. The first evening following Laura's departure from Emma appeared more subdued than normal, so we ate dinner together, and I attempted to create asking him about school and his most recent endeavor, a 3D model that he had been. He responded courteously after weeks of printing, but he said very little, his gaze darting to mine, and then he was gone again. "You're anxious about something, okay?" I scowled as I asked, "Buddy, you've been kind of—" He smiled slightly at me tonight despite the silence. However, it didn't make it to his eyes. I assume I didn't push it. I'm simply exhausted. Emma has consistently been more quiet, and I assumed he would divulge if something was truly annoying him. But I didn't say anything, so I retired to bed as Laura's side of the bed felt normal as usual. More empty than before, and I discovered missing her company and her warmth body close to mine, her quiet, whispering voice when she fell asleep. I shut the lights off, closed my eyes, and allowed the house's rhythmic sound to lull. Me to go to sleep at some point during the faintest sound woke me up that night. The bedroom door's creak is opening, squinting into my heart's darkness. Without missing a beat, the room fell silent, aside from the noise of my own. The slight rustling of fabric and breathing I muttered as someone approached Laura. My first voice was heavy with slumber, believed that she had arrived home early. Perhaps to my surprise, the figure didn't reply. The mattress dipped instead. A little as the individual sat on my sleep-deprived mind, attempted to put together what was going on, but before I could completely awaken, I experienced it was a kind hand on my leg. Laura's hand making such a familiar move. Her method of anchoring me is by my arm or leg. Her method of expressing her presence, but the hand felt strange and it persisted. The touch is too hesitant, as if the person was attempting to imitate her. Motions, but I wasn't entirely sure how I opened my eyes and adjusted my vision to the dim illumination of the moon. What I saw was flooding through the slats. Stopped my heart from sitting next to me. I said, "It was Emma, not Laura." I sounded confused and alarmed. The fact that he didn't move his hand still lightly resting on my arm. Although my face was partially obscured, I could observe the uneasiness in his lips and gaze. Parted as like he had something to say. but nothing was said. Is everything all right? I sat up and inquired, and now my pulse was racing and I could sense his heat. Hand through my shirt's material, why are you your father? He cut off. Not much more than a whisper. I didn't mean I only scowled in uncertainty to wake you. Expanding? Then why are you growing? Paused, letting his hand fall away as I'm not sure he looked down at the floor. Whispered, I just wanted to make. I blinked at him to make sure you were all right. Uncertain of what to say, he was observing me with such uncertainty and vulnerability tighten. I'm okay, Emma. I made my chest gently, but you ought to be in bed. For a brief moment, it is late, and he did not move. Then he slowly raised his shoulders. Slumped, I apologize, but I'll go as he turned to leave me wanting something. I had no idea what it was that stopped him. Perhaps his dejected appearance or the odd sense of shame that is creeping in my gut. But I allowed him to go while observing him vanish through the door as I reclined. Down, gazing up at the ceiling, my thoughts, what had it been about? Racer? And why did he enter my room in that manner? Did that cause me to feel so uneasy? But the most absurd aspect was that it continued. Oh no, the tale most certainly didn't end here, not yet. I woke up the following morning. I had hardly slept and woke up earlier than usual. Following Emma's unannounced arrival, my thoughts impossible to relax each time I shut my eyes, I relived the scene as Hesitantly, he sat on the bed. The manner in which his hand hovered above me as though he wasn't certain whether he ought to be. It was unnerving there, but not in the I shook the ideas away as I had anticipated. By the time I finished getting dressed for the day, Emma was already at the door when she stepped downstairs. Scrolling and drinking coffee at the table, he looked up on his phone when I walked with an understandable expression, but he was standing with a stiff posture. Something wasn't there in the morning. Stated, attempting to seem light. Yes, he said in a hushed voice. Up early. Struggled to fall asleep and paused for a pause prior to making myself a cup of drinking coffee and taking a seat across from him. About last night, Emma, I apologize. Cut off his speech more abruptly than I didn't intend to frighten you. Or anything that I should not have entered your room is fine, I said hastily. I was only concerned that you appeared unhappy. Shrugged, returning his attention to his phone. Don't worry about it, but I was unable to ignore it. The way he had regarded me as he had stroked my arm was too purposeful and significant. To somehow be dismissed as inconsequential, I couldn't quite pinpoint it, but it had excited me. It, and the most bizarre thing, was that I felt from his end as well. I wanted to ask him further questions to determine what was running through his mind. Yet something in his nonverbal cues told me to leave it. I'm alone for the time being, so I did the remainder of the day go by. Emma stayed in his room without incident for the majority of it, and I kept myself busy with tasks and errands in an attempt to get rid of the persistent uneasiness by nightfall. When I turned around, I was worn out and prepared. In an attempt to avoid falling into bed, I reflect on the night before as I crawled beneath the blankets. Yet my thoughts continued to ponder what had motivated Emma entering my room in that manner. Was he experiencing something that he wasn't describing something to me, or was there something? Another thing I didn't want to acknowledge must have fallen asleep at some time, because I realized that the next thing I was the sound of the door waking me up. My heart leapt as it creaked open once more. Squinting into the darkness, I sat up. I whispered, Laura, even though I knew it. The figure at the doorway wasn't her. Paused prior to entering, and in the moonlight, Emma's familiar my heart rate increased, due to a combination of confusion as well as another issue I was unable to name, as though the circumstances were the same. Played once again in my head, I believed maybe I was dreaming, Emma, I said, colored with fury and worry. Why are you back here, and what's going on? He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he went to the bed and took a seat on the edge. Just like the previous evening, was dressed in a baggy t-shirt and sweatpants, his sleep untidy hair, and his stance revealed a vulnerability. That pulled at a deep part of me. I apologize, he whispered quietly, His eyes locked on the ground. I realize this is strange, but I asked since I didn't want to be alone. Voice softer now, Emma. What's going on? He hesitated before saying, You can talk to me. Fingers tinkering with his hemshirt. I'm not sure, he acknowledged. It's simply, Clara is not here. Mum is gone. And the house seems so deserted. So I suppose I just wanted to have a sense of intimacy with someone's remarks struck me more strongly than I anticipated, that I would have been so self-centered. Feeling so alone without Laura that I hadn't thought about how it may be influencing Emma. He had never spoken in taciturn, but perhaps that was his style. Having trouble, but it's okay, I said. A hand on his shoulder, letting him know he's not alone. I'm here, Emma. He glanced up at me. His gaze swept across mine, and for a brief. Between us, the air felt electrified with I couldn't explain it, so I offered his smile and gave his shoulder a comforting squeeze. Come on, I'm trying to reduce the stress. Remarked, If it helps, you can pat the bed. Spend some time here, but you must pledge to get a decent night's sleep. Didn't understand why I said that, as in, I somehow thought that I also didn't desire to sleep once more as well. He nodded, a tiny smile peeking out from under his anxious look. Okay, thanks. Dad Emma reclined on the opposite side of the keeping a reasonable distance from the bed. I shut out the lights and shut my eyes. Attempting to disregard the odd combination of, with feelings rushing through me, the room was quiet aside from the sound of our breathing, and his presence was palpable. Next to me, like a steady, warm pulse I dozed off at one point, but it was a sleeping restlessly. I awoke once more and my senses are on high in the middle of the night. Alert, although I wasn't certain what had roused me. Initially, but then I sensed a light Emma. I hesitated before touching my arm. I spoke in a drowsy murmur, but he didn't respond, but his hand continued to touch. It felt so soft against my flesh. Gentle, purposeful motion that my breath. My mind shouted in my throat at I should have spoken something to halt this earlier. My body wouldn't allow it to go any farther. He muttered in a barely audible voice. To move, Dad. Audible. I'm sorry, I simply looked at him as I turned my head. His face, my heart thumping in my chest, stood just inches away from me. His eyes full with a mixture of want and terror that I couldn't disregard before I spoke. He leant in and brushed anything against his lips, an emotion against my cheek. So it was so soft and short that I questioned my startled friend. What are you doing? Voice shaking, but not out of fear. He acknowledged his voice, but I'm not sure. I simply don't know the room. Breaking was tense, and the quiet extending like a taut wire between us. I desired to make a statement to break the spell, but my thoughts were frozen. Moving too quickly to comprehend, Emma pulled his face back a little. I apologize, a mixture of desperation and shame. His voice cracked in a whisper. I should have gone before doing that. I could reply, but he had vanished. Into the shadows and abandoning me under the crippling burden of what had simply occurred. I believe he was unaware of it. That didn't bother me. In fact, I quite enjoyed it when he went, and I now felt sorry for I was certain that I wanted more of it. Never encountered this, but as of right now, I decided to attempt ignoring it at least, and tomorrow I'd like to invite him to sleep with me. Occasionally perhaps talk about it, so I did the next day. I was unable to concentrate on whatever that kept coming to mind. Returning to Emma with a tentative touch, his apologized in a whisper, the way his lips had just touched my cheek. It was too peculiar, but I can't get Emma out of my head. He kept away from me all morning, staying in his... The door of the room was closed, and I reassured myself to have the guts to knock. He most likely needed time to think. Whatever had occurred, and to be honest, but the longer the hours passed, the household tension reached an intolerable level. By mid-afternoon, I was unable to handle it. I was now standing outside. My hand hovered a few inches above his door. I thought for a moment from the wood leaving, but I knocked gently first. I called Emma while attempting to speak quietly. Stable, may we speak? It was a lengthy pause before his footsteps could be heard. Getting closer, he opened the door. Appeared different from his typical guarded. Something took the place of the expression. Softer, nearly defenseless, and it made my... He stepped softly and murmured, "Hey, chest ache." I stepped into his and he moved aside to let me enter. Taking a moment to look around the room was as tidy and well organized as he was, but there was a lingering sense of hesitancy. He motioned me to take a seat over the area. In bed, and I complied with my anxieties were begging me to get out. I said, just wanted to check in. After a... He winced when he thought about yesterday night. I apologize. His shoulders are hunching a little. Added hastily, I realize it was strange. I shouldn't have interrupted Emma. Holding up a hand, I'm not angry, it's all right. I really must comprehend what is happening. And I'd like to share something with you. His hands were fluttering in his lap as he hesitated. I'm not sure, but I suppose he eventually admitted. Sometimes I simply feel so alone, and it's like I don't know when Mum is gone. Like even with you, the place feels empty. His remarks struck me more forcefully than I had always attempted to be a good father. But after hearing him say that, he felt isolated. Emma, I'm sorry if I offended you. I whispered softly. You feel like you're not alone, okay? I'm always here for you. He nodded, but he continued to stare at... I am aware that the floor isn't the leaning. What do you mean by that? He leant forward a little and inhaled deeply. It's difficult to see his hands squeezing into fists. He spoke in a barely audible voice to clarify. It seems like I want to be above a whisper. Near you, but not as close as I am expected to, and I'm at a loss on what to do. His comments lingered in the air after that. I felt my gut, and it was raw and heavy, twist into knots that I was not of how to. A part of me wanted to brush it off in response. Left to inform him that it was only a phase, but an additional section that I didn't want to admit to feeling a mysterious attraction, Emma. I started gently towards him. Believe you're perplexed. It's common to... I don't feel confused, he stated confidently. He cut me off, then his eyes met mine, brimming with an understated ferocity that made I know how I feel, and it makes my heart skip a beat. And I am aware that it is abnormal, but I am unable to. I tried to react, but I couldn't help myself. We sat because the words wouldn't come. There, silently, the burden of his confession weighing us down like I wanted to console him with physical force. To reassure him that it would be all right, but I was unaware that this was uncharted. I was absolutely lost in territory. I still hadn't expressed my feelings to him, but what remained would transform the narrative all over the place that evening. I attempted to pretend that everything was normal. We ate dinner together and discussed routine tasks like work and school, but there was an implicit conflict between us. That neither of us discussed, I was unable to feel his gaze on me at all times. Away, causing my skin to prickle with a mixture of uneasiness, and another thing, I intended to ask him to tell me his name, but join me this evening. But when I attempted to simply was unable to open my mouth. When I eventually went to sleep, I was unable to dispel the impression that the evening wasn't. I was lying in the dark, gazing at the ceiling while my mind raced over Emma's. His voice played words in my head, loaded with a great deal of vulnerability and desire that made me gasp for air, and so I got out of bed and went directly to. He remained awake in Emma's room. Murmured, he initially didn't respond, but Emma, I'm sure he heard me. Would you be interested in joining me tonight? Yes, son, I would love to, responded Dad. Without hesitation, he ascended, directly onto my bed, causing his weight to. He sat with the mattress dipping a little. His hands were briefly resting on his knees, then he extended his hand and put a hand on my arm as I walked in. The bed too, Dad, he added quietly. Shaky voice. Please thrill me like a mum, I screamed in my head as I glanced at him. I should stop now and say something. something that would stop whatever was going on, but I was unable to. The expression in his eyes, the unadulterated feeling in his voice made me utterly helpless. Emma, this isn't me started, but he interrupted me, didn't he? His hand tightened on my arm in a whisper. I swallowed hard, so please let me stay. My voice is dry, yet I said at last, my unsteady voice, but we must discuss. He gave a slight nod this morning, a smile tugging at his lip corners. As he lay down, he said, "Thank you." Besides me, I experienced an odd combination of feelings whirling within me. Remorse, fear, and something that is perilously near. I had no idea what the anticipation was. Occurring between us, but I was aware of one. This was definitely not the end of it. I spun around and we looked at each other. There was tension right away that we both knew what we couldn't resist was going to occur, so I sat up and thought. I said, "Racing? This isn't okay." Voice faltered. "You must return to— I don't want to enter your room," he remarked. Eyes meeting mine, regardless of whether I can't continue to act as though I avoid having this feeling before I could. In response, he extended his hand and brushed— it was a gentle touch against my cheek. It was almost respectful, and it made me shudder. I muttered, "Please, Emma," down my spine. My voice was shaking. Wasn't he leaning? His lips grazing mine at that moment with a hesitant kiss that was— my thoughts begged me to quit being so persistent. To shove him away, but my body wouldn't move everything else for a moment. The shame and the anxiety vanished. It was all impossible. There was only Emma's warmth, his touch, his despair. And at that precise time, I was unable to get myself to remove that the kiss lasted longer than necessary. More time than it was entitled to Emma's soft. Hesitant lips were present, but there was an urgency underlying them. A pressing need to close the gap that has developed between. My intellect begged me to put an end to this, to distance oneself and terminate whatever had started to get out of hand, but I was frozen at the instant when my body betrayed me. Incapable of moving when he eventually withdrew. He looked back into my overflowing eyes. With a mixture of fear, desire, and something that appeared perilously near, I spoke in a barely audible voice to Hope Emma. "I know it's a whisper, but we can't." "False," he said, his voice quivering. "I can't continue to pretend, though, so I don't care. I can't continue to keep my feelings from you, Dad." I didn't mean to shake my head. "You are perplexed. This isn't real." He said firmly, his eyes locking. "Real?" Onto mine, I'm more certain than ever of his remark struck me in every aspect of my life, like a tidal wave that left me gasping for air. And confused, I wanted to inform him that he was wrong, but the conviction in his voice, the unadulterated truth in his eyes made it hard to ignore that he truly believed what he was saying. "I don't know what to do with this." I admitted, my voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "I don't know how to fix this. You don't have to fix anything," he said, reaching out to take my hand. His touch was warm grounding, and it made my pulse quicken. Despite my better judgment, "Just let me in." "Please," I pulled my hand away, my chest tightening with a mix of fear and guilt. "Emma, this isn't about what I want. It's about what's right, and this isn't right." He looked down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I know you think that," he said quietly, "but I also know you don't really believe it." Not completely, his words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Was it guilt, shame, or was it the terrifying realization that a part of me didn't want to push him away? While I was silent for a moment, some excitement hit me. I looked him in the eyes, and I think he noticed it too. All of a sudden, the whole tension turned around into something way different than what our conversation was about. But from the way he moved quickly, I knew for sure that we had both felt this for the last couple of days. Now the kiss had evoked something in me that I couldn't ignore, after a way too long. "Silence," I said. "Kiss me again." Emma, what he said, surprised. "Inly, do it, Emma. As you mentioned earlier, pretend to do what Mom would do." I didn't hold back anymore. All of a sudden, something had shifted in me, and I did not hold back anything anymore. Emma leaned into me and we kissed again this time. Different, better, more intense while kissing. He grabbed me at places, Laura would too. It went from kissing to more and from bad to worse. I couldn't stop it. I did not want it to. I'm not going to go in detail, but I can tell you it was amazing. Intense, sensitive, and from his side, I think a bit hurtful. I don't know why, but he had taken his role as Laura quite seriously. I could notice it from the way he mentioned my name after I had finished. He laid there, we both not knowing what had just happened. Are you okay, son? I said, Yes, Dad. Don't worry about me. Let me go to the bathroom for a moment, and let's just go to sleep. That is the last part I can remember vividly. I think I dozed away when he was in the bathroom. The morning after I was up early thinking about what happened last night, I was halfway through my coffee. When I heard footsteps on the stairs, I didn't need to turn around to know it was Emma. His presence seemed to fill the room before he even said a word. Morning, he said softly, his voice tentative. I turned to face him, offering a small smile. Morning coffee on the counter, he nodded, walking over to pour himself a cup for a moment. We stood in silence, the tension between us palpable. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Emma, I began setting my mug down. We need to talk. He stiffened his shoulders, tensing as he turned to face me about last night. He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, about everything I said. I need to understand what's going on with you. What's going on with us? He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know. He admitted, I feel like I've been holding this in for so long and I couldn't anymore. I know it's wrong, Dad. I know that, but I can't help how I feel. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he didn't really feel this way, but the look in his eyes told me otherwise. This wasn't some fleeting thought or teenage confusion. It was something deeper, something that scared me more than I cared to admit. Emma, I said carefully, I need you to understand that what you're feeling, it's complicated and it's us like a thick fog. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I didn't know how. This was uncharted territory, and I felt like I was walking a tight RPP, one wrong step away from falling. The rest of the day was awkward, to say the least. Emma stayed in his room for most of it, and I tried to distract myself with chores and errands, but my mind kept drifting back to him every time I thought about the way he looked at me, so raw. So vulnerable, I felt my chest tighten by the time evening rolled around as I sat in the living room nursing a glass of whiskey. Emma appeared in the doorway. He looked hesitant, his hands shoved into his pockets, but there was a determination in his eyes that made my heart race. Can I sit? He asked, his voice quiet. I nodded, unable to find the words to refuse him. He walked over and sat down on the couch beside me, leaving a careful amount of space between us. I'm sorry, he said, after a long silence, for making things weird. I didn't mean to. I just didn't know how to handle it. I know, I said, my voice soft. It's okay. We'll figure this out. He looked at me. Then his eyes filled with so much vulnerability that it made my chest ache. Do you hate me? He asked, his voice barely audible. Of course not, I said immediately, placing a hand on his shoulder. I could never hate you, Emma. You're my son. He flinched slightly at the word, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into my touch, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. I just want to be close to you, he said, his voice trembling. I don't care how, I need you. His words broke something inside me, and I pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly as he buried his face in my shoulder. I'm here, I whispered. I'll always be here. For a moment, it felt like everything might be okay, that we could find a way to move past this and rebuild our relationship. But as he pulled back and looked up at me, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears, I felt that familiar tension creeping back in. Thank you, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, for not giving up on me. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As he stood to leave, I reached out and grabbed his hand. Stopping him in his tracks, Emma, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, we'll figure this out together. He smiled, a small, tentative smile that sent a pang of warmth through my chest. I know we will, he said. And as he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that our story was far from over the lines we had drawn, were already beginning to blur. And though I didn't know what the future held, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again.